Okay, guys, we're going to pick up right where we left off. We're going to talk about evolution, heredity, and environment. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolutionary perspective, what evolutionary psychology is, and this idea of evolutionary developmental psychology, just to kind of throw in as some more terms there and basically combine a bunch of these different fields. So the idea of evolution, of course, comes from Charles Darwin's 1859 On the Origin of Species, talking about sort of this idea of survival of the fittest, that the things that we do now, the behaviors that we have, everything that for example, the human species does, has at some point in our history of, hundreds of thousands of years, have served a purpose. And that purpose has been our survival. So things that we do that we may not really understand sometimes may not serve us a purpose now, but at some point in our history has served a purpose. So for example, you can look at mate selection. So what men look for in a woman versus what women look for in a man. They vary, and there are gender differences there. And so the idea is that, during a time where, we were hunting and gathering and before modern times, that seeking out, for example, a woman seeking out a man that had resources and was able to stay with her, that's really important. And so that translates to today, a woman looking for stability in a man, having a job, being able to maintain, his own apartment and have a job. All of these things are important. Whereas men, back in, hunting gathering days, were looking for women who were attractive and who had, wider hips. And, that signified good genes because, a man wanted to reproduce with a woman to maintain the species survival. And so, of course, this translates to today, where if you look at men looking for a mate, a woman, okay, and again, these are heterosexual relationships. What we find is that a man is actually much more likely to look for a woman who is attractive over stability, whereas a woman is looking for stability over attractiveness. And so these ideas, these behaviors that we have today, stem from some of these evolutionary concepts that were built into our species over a long time. And so this evolutionary perspective is using some of these ideas to explain some of our behaviors and figure out why is this important, and why does an adolescent do this and act like this. And so this perspective is then applied to, in this case, psychology. And so evolutionary psychology is looking at that behavior over our species. And so looking at, for example, at adaptive behaviors, looking at reproduction, this idea of survival of the fittest, reproductive ability, passing our genes on, and why that's important for our particular species. And so evolutionary developmental psychology is putting it all together and saying, okay, now let's look at these concepts that are in evolutionary psychology to understand human development and look at this period of extended childhood and why this would be important to even consider. And so, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that are studied in this area, here is a table. If you look in the slides, you see a table that looks at the brain sizes of primates and non-human primates in relation to the juvenile period. And so here you can see that humans have a pretty large brain size and a considerable period of juvenile development as compared to different primates. And so this idea is that this juvenile period, this adolescent period, and is related to brain size and also related to the complexity of the species. And obviously this was very important for human species to go through and to have this, what's really an extended developmental period of maturation from childhood to adulthood, that this must serve some very big importance for us to go through this period for so long. So some of the things that we talk about in terms of this genetic process and looking at passing genes down, this is just some very basic terminology so that everybody's on the same par. So the idea that, a lot of the things that the traits and characteristics that we have are genetically influenced and retained in our DNA. So all of us have a genetic code. We inherit each of those codes from our parents. And so that is in our DNA. Our DNA contains chromosomes, which we have pairs, one pair from our mother and one pair from our father. The DNA is this complex thread-like structures that make up our genetic code. And individual genes are these segments of DNA, and those segments tell the cells to do certain jobs and produce particular proteins. And so that information is then translated into genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the actual code. This is actual material that is in our DNA. And then our phenotype is what we see. It's what is observed. It's what's expressed from that DNA. And so when we look at genetics, a single gene is very rarely ever the source of a protein's genetic information, and much less of an inherited trait. We have to look at groupings of independent genes. We have to look at the collaboration among all of these genotypes and how that works to really get to where we are in terms of expressing particular traits. We know that particular things can actually affect gene expression. For example, sleep deprivation can affect gene expression. It can increase inflammation throughout your body. We call that systemic inflammation. It's in your blood. It can actually be related to expression of stress related genes, and increase our level of stress hormones, which can affect our health. And it can impair protein functioning. And anytime you impair functioning, and that can translate to problems with the cells themselves. And of course, if you have any sort of replication issues, then that can lead to cancer, and it can lead to a lot of physical health problems. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but we've seen a lot of studies that show things like external events that are outside the cell and outside the person. And the environment can actually inhibit or excite gene expression. So it can actually change what genes we express and what alleles that we turn on or off. And that impacting this gene expression can actually be passed down from a family. And so we've actually seen a lot of study. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because this isn't a genetics class, but we've actually seen studies where, for example, if your great-grandparents grew up during a drought or a period of famine, can actually affect you. And affect how likely you are to be obese and how likely you are to gain weight and to be healthy. So we can pass these down from generation to generation and be affected by our behaviors that we did as children and as adults. And so if that's before, of childbearing age, that can be passed on to the next generation and so on and so forth. And so the idea of looking at how heredity influences human traits and development, this is what we refer to as behavioral genetics. And so this is a really interesting field where it looks a lot at identical twins, which are referred to as monozygotic twins, and fraternal twins, which are dizygotic. So these are identical versus fraternal, when we're looking at things like adoption studies. So taking identical twins and separating them at birth. And so you have technically identical DNA structure if they're identical, if they're monozygotic from one egg, if they reproduce from one egg, then what we're seeing is that we can actually raise them. We see them raised in two separate environments, and then whatever similarities they have, we can attribute to genetics, because they don't share the same environment. This starts getting complicated. You can have identical twins who share the same embryonic sac, and they have an absolute identical environment, and that can change things. Or if they actually are separated into their own sacs, and that's something that we actually can't even really go back and test for. That's something that we would have to either know during gestation, or we're never going to know. And so that can affect how similar the genetic structures are. But we can actually see differences in gene expression in identical twins due to environmental influences. That's what explains why we have two identical twins, and one might get breast cancer and the other one might not. And they can even be in similar environments. There have been some really fascinating studies of twins who have been separated at birth, never knew each other, on separate sides of the U.S. or even of the world, and never grew up together. But the first time they ever met, they're wearing the same shirt. They, named their child the same name, and they're experiencing these really insane, what look like coincidences. But we have to ask ourselves, are these genetically influenced? What part of our behaviors are actually a product of our genes? And I think these are some really fascinating questions that can be answered through these twin studies. And so when we look at these, and I actually didn't, sorry about that, I meant to jump ahead in the slide. But when we look at some of these interactions, we know that we have to think about what part is genetics and what part is environment. And so this is just kind of a quick table to kind of show you some of these, some passive correlation, evocative correlation. There's just some good information on the slide that I want you to kind of just take a look at to see where we can see where there's a few examples here for you to take a look at in terms of what correlations we see with this heredity and environmental relationships. And so what we need to consider is this other giant factor, which we refer to as epigenetics. And so this is related into all of this, and that epigenetics is this idea that heredity affects environment can affect heredity. And there's this interaction and interplay where we actually see a contribution to what we do, the actions that we take place, and how that can actually trigger certain things happening in our genes and make us more or less likely to, for example, have a disease or take part in particular behaviors. And so we talk about having genes for eye color and intelligence and personality and other characteristics, but that's really, really oversimplifying the whole thing. We know that genetics and environment are actually interplaying. And this idea of epigenetics, which refers to above genetics, this idea that we're a product of our environment, but we also produce our environment, and we're affected by it, and we affect it. These are all important characteristics that you really need to know and have a good grasp of for this entire class, because we're going to talk a lot about this complexity between what's going on physically, what's going on in the genes, and then what also is going on in the environment that could be triggering a lot of this stuff. So I really find a lot of this genetics, a lot of epigenetics and behavioral genetics really fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't get to go as much in detail as I would like in this class, but just kind of scratching the surface here. So everybody knows that there isn't really a nature versus nurture anymore. It's nature and nurture. This interaction is extremely important. So, the heredity environment correlation view is, heredity is sort of impacting environment, but really the epigenetic view is this is the one where everyone's really sort of understanding that it's an interplay between heredity and environment. The example that I gave about your great-grandparents, if they're going through famine, being passed down, whether you're more or less likely to be healthy, more or less likely to be obese. That is all epigenetics. That's epigenetics as pure as it gets. So these are some really, really fascinating things. So that does it for chapter 2. We're going to go ahead and begin chapter 3 during our next class. I'm not going to do any videos in chapter 3 unless there's another snow day or problem, so we can start fresh with that. So if you guys have any questions, bring them to class with you during next class, and or email me. If there's anything that wasn't clear or anything that I kind of skimmed over, just let me know. I try not to read too much from the slides because you have those in front of you, and try to add a few bits of information in from the side. So write down if you have any questions, and let me know. And I hope you guys have a good night.